Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. Welcome to my 300th video, and many thanks to everyone who has subscribed to the channel. Your support is very much appreciated. There are a few people around who aren't too happy about the poor box office performance for Disney's 2023 live-action remake of The Little Mermaid. But the fact of the matter is that it's not that good of a movie. And in spite of the efforts by Rotten Tomatoes and now IMDb also to conceal the actual low audience scores for the movie, most probably after Disney paid a substantial amount of hush money to both websites, it's not actually changing the fact that most people just aren't that interested in seeing the movie. And of those who have, most weren't that impressed. And that's what Disney doesn't want potential moviegoers to know, because they are desperate to make as much money as they possibly can with The Little Mermaid. Why? As I had talked about in a video that I had released earlier this week about the movie's lackluster opening weekend box office, which the shill media initially tried to hide by only talking about the domestic box office and not about how awful the international box office for the movie is, well, the movie's production budget is reportedly very high at $250 million. But since I recorded that video, Deadline has reported that Disney, in addition to that high production budget, has spent around $140 million to market the movie. In other words, Disney's total cost for The Little Mermaid is at least $390 million. And since movie theaters keep 50% of the gross box office ticket sales for themselves, that $390 million has to be doubled to see what the movie's break-even point is. And that number is $780 million. Now, if you saw my video that I had released earlier this week, or any of my other videos where I estimate a movie's break-even point, then you'll know that I typically multiply a movie's production budget by 2.5 to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as to estimate how much the studio may have paid for marketing and other miscellaneous costs that are above and beyond the production budget. For The Little Mermaid, I had initially estimated the movie's break-even point by multiplying $250 million by 2.5 to get $625 million. But I had also said in that video that due to how much money Disney has likely spent to market the movie, the break-even point may be closer to 3 times the production budget, or $750 million. And I had also said that some are suggesting that the movie's break-even point may be even closer to $800 million. Well, by knowing that Disney has spent around $140 million to market the movie, the $780 million that Disney needs in order for the movie to break even is at least 3.12 times the $250 million production budget. While a multiplication factor that's greater than 3 is not uncommon to account for the amount of marketing that studios pay for blockbuster superhero movies, it's not as common for fantasy movies like The Little Mermaid. So the fact that Disney has spent that much money to market the movie, combined with the hush money that they more than likely paid to Rotten Tomatoes and Amazon, which owns IMDb, to conceal the bad audience scores, is totally an act of desperation. And I don't believe that Disney's gamble is going to pay off, because predictions for the movie's second weekend box office are in, and they're not good at all. With Sony's Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse opening this weekend, the domestic second weekend box office for The Little Mermaid is predicted to be around $37 million, which is a 61% drop from its opening weekend. Anytime that a movie's second weekend box office suffers from a drop-off that's greater than 60%, that's never a good sign for its long-term earnings potential, and a drop-off like that has been a lot more common for many MCU superhero movies. But what this ultimately says is that domestic interest in the movie is plummeting, which absolutely coincides with the poor audience scores that Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb are trying to prevent their respective visitors from seeing. Both sites are prominently showing phony average audience scores, a phony 95% on Rotten Tomatoes that's actually a lot closer to 57%, and a phony 7.2 rating on IMDb, which, if you dig deeper by clicking on the rating, you'll see that the unweighted average is actually 4.6, which is more in line with the low all-audience score on Rotten Tomatoes and the abysmal 2.2 audience score on Metacritic. Then there's a claim made on top of the movie's audience score page on IMDb, claiming, "Our rating mechanism has detected unusual voting activity on this title. To preserve the reliability of our rating system, an alternate weighting calculation has been applied." In other words, someone doesn't want site visitors to see just how low the average audience score actually is. So without any evidence provided to back up their claim, IMDb is preventing the more visible average audience score for The Little Mermaid from going below 7.0, just like Rotten Tomatoes is preventing its main audience score from falling below 95%. The reality here is that Disney was anticipating that moviegoers would just fall head over heels in love with their live-action remake of The Little Mermaid, but that's not happening. And what does the predicted second weekend domestic box office of $37 million for the movie say about its potential long-term earnings? Since I don't yet have actual international second weekend box office totals yet, I can use the opening weekend's domestic share of 63.2% to estimate what the global box office might be from the predicted $37 million domestic second weekend box office. Based on that, the projected global box office drop for the second weekend is around 30.33%, which is at the top of the range of the 40 to 30% week-to-week drops in global box office that I had used in my original projections. From these values, projecting a 30.33% week-to-week drop in global box office into the future with a 63.2% domestic share leads to a final projected global box office of around $539 million, which is in line with the projections that I had made last week and is well below the movie's $780 million break-even point. Because Monday was a holiday only in the US, I'm treating the 63.2% domestic share, which includes Monday's box office, as part of the overall domestic opening weekend box office. But if I exclude it, I get a lower domestic share that isn't realistic since Memorial Day isn't celebrated worldwide. But I decided to average the two domestic shares to get a value of 60.78% to provide a slightly improved international box office for a potentially more optimistic outlook. When using that domestic share, I also get a lower week-to-week drop in global box office of around 23.59%, which, if I carry forward, leads to a far more optimistic final projected potential global box office of around $687 million, which is still in line with some of the projections that I had made before the movie's opening weekend, but is still well below the $780 million break-even point for the movie. In other words, the predicted 61% drop in domestic box office for the movie's second weekend is still suggesting that the movie is probably going to flop, and that the only way that the movie could possibly break even would be if its international box office greatly improves, which I find highly doubtful. But we'll know more when the actual domestic and international second weekend box office numbers are reported in a couple of days. Until then, assuming that Disney's remake of The Little Mermaid is probably going to flop remains a safe bet. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.